on.
So, yeah, so I apologize for being late. I felt compelled to stop in and answer some questions, so.
You're not late. Look at that.
What?
You're not late.
I know, I'm right on time. Although it does appear to be 6 o'clock, so I will call the special meeting of the Planning Board on May 3rd, 2022 to order. We will start with roll call, and I sometimes I start on my left, so tonight I will start on my far right.
Matthew Duval.
Tony Ferrara.
Stacy LeBlanc.
Evan Sear.
Paul Jacques. Josh Daigle.
Darren Finnegan.
Brian Dubois.
And of note, Mr. Riley Bergeron has let me know that he will be in attendance. He is on his way, but he will be running possibly a few minutes late. The next thing on our agenda are the, and having said that, normally we would elevate one of our associate members to being a full voting member, but because they're, I perhaps, well, let me ask, you were both at the meeting, correct? Mr. Jakes, why don't we elevate you to a voting member in order to handle the minutes? Yes?
Sure.
Great. So for this item, Mr. Jakes will be a full voting member. The minutes for the April 12, 2022 meeting have been made available. Are there any edits to the minutes that people would like to make?
At least on the first page, under item number 3, my last name is misspelled. Needs 2 L's.
Are there any other edits or amendments? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to accept the minutes as amended.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second is over here. All those in favor by show of hands? The minutes have been approved. The remaining items on the agenda for tonight do not require action by the planning board. As such, I do not anticipate any votes. I would like to remind members of the public and members of the board that normally all of us would be involved in discussion and asking questions, but only those full members wouldn't be involved in making motion and taking votes. Because there are unlikely to be any motions or votes, a reminder that all members of the planning board are encouraged to participate, including our associate members as always. So.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Can I make a motion to reconsider the minutes? I found another 1L Duval.
Yes.
On page 5.
There's a motion to reconsider to add an edit. Is there a second?
Second.
I don't think we actually need a second on a motion to reconsider, do
Well,
we?
what you have to do is I have to propose the change and then we have to vote again.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we have to, that's right, okay.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Policy procedure, right?
Yeah, right.
All right, so,
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
is there a second?
Second.
Excellent. All those in favor? All right, the minutes are approved as amended. Excuse me. Next on our agenda, we have a workshop. This is part 2 of the T42B, being so-called A through D, to consider changing 4 areas of the city from rural residential, urban residential, suburban residential, and multifamily suburban areas to the traditional neighborhood development district as defined in the comprehensive plan. Area A includes 936 acres of urban residential, multifamily, suburban, and rural residential within the New Auburn urban residential areas and to Broad Street. Area B includes 19 acres of urban residential within the Vickery Road area. Area C includes 140 acres of suburban residential and urban residential within the Poland Manley Hotel Road residential area. And Area D includes 288 acres of urban residential and multifamily suburban within the Bates, Bradman, Stetson Road residential area. And before I move on to staff, Mr. Bergeron has arrived, so please introduce yourself. No worries.
Ryan Bergeron.
Excuse me. I think it's also an opportune time. We do have members of the public to remind folks the difference between a hearing and a workshop. And in public hearings, the board invites members of the public to speak on an item. In a workshop, we are really here to hear information from staff and to ask questions. And anything that comes up in a workshop will subsequently be brought up again in a public hearing in order to allow public to give input to the board. So having said that, is staff ready to present on this item?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, everyone, for being here tonight. Appreciate everybody being here in a special meeting. I really want this meeting to be more of an open communication amongst all of us. I think we've got, as a planning board, we really need to provide some guidance to the council, basically on what the comprehensive plan says in 2021, and then what really should fit the character or the areas that we're talking about here, these 4 specific areas, as Evan mentioned earlier. As we go through it, as staff, we're making some suggestions, but I think we'd like to get some questions as we go through it to kind of have some dialogue back and forth on where we should land in terms of a recommendation as we approach this to a vote at hopefully the next meeting. Some of the items that we're going to cover tonight, they've tabled the subsurface wastewater decision-making. The council did that last night. And some of what we're doing for the zone change in the Lake Auburn watershed is contingent upon that. So I think this is, it goes back to what the recommendation from the planning board was. And you guys essentially created that environment to have the council kind of table all of their decision-making processes to get your feedback and basically catch the zoning up with the ordinance change. So so those 2 things are important. They go together. Again, the first on the agenda is considering the changing 4 areas of the city from rural residential, urban residential, suburban residential, and multifamily suburban areas to a traditional neighborhood development district, T-4.2, or some variation. So as even in our language, as we read through the agenda, we have 4.2B in the staff report. You know, we may even have T-4.2. There's a little bit of uncertainty among the staff, and I think that's part of the reason is that we've had a lot of public input, and we've had a lot of back and forth even from the council on this, and we just kind of want to get a clearer vision of what we want to do and get a better product, I think, at the end of the day. Second part of the agenda is the Lake Auburn watershed zone change with the adoption of zoning that reduces the housing density in all parts of Lake Auburn watershed from 1 dwelling unit per 3 acres, from one dwelling per acre to 3 acres for one dwelling unit. This is a recommendation in the 2021 comprehensive plan. And then essentially what we're doing is that we're taking the rural residential, that's 1 acre, and then we're shifting that over to low country density residential areas to make it 3 acres and 325 feet of potential lot size. So we looked at the total acreage involved in this, in the watershed. It's about 1,038 acres. This is,
So, John, before you go on, just on the agenda, one clarifying. The wording says all areas of the Lake Auburn watershed, we really don't mean all, right?
No.
We mean areas that are currently zoned rural residential.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Area A, this is the first section. It's about 936 acres. And it's basically the bigger area, one of the bigger areas that we're looking at. As you can see, the urban residential area, I'll just point to it out on the map here, the urban residential area and the multifamily residential area. And then some of this rural residential, and then even down in here, you've got a little bit of low-density country residential. So these are 3-acre minimums right now. The comp plan really is pushing this to 16 units per acre. That in itself could be a big change in the rural residential and the low country density residential. Some of this that staff is suggesting is that we either create a new T-4.0 or T 4.1 in this rural residential area, in low country density residential area, and then in the urban residential in the multifamily, we're looking more at the original T 4.2 or B version of that really takes away a lot of the business uses as was recommended by the council. To get our density to 14 units per acre, we really need to have about, for a 10,000 square foot lot, we really need, three stories and 14 units per acre is the minimum size for that. So, again, this is the area, and so this potentially could be a split zone. Area B is a smaller area, 19 acres. It's all urban residential, but based on the units and the number of houses there, we could be looking at a version of T 4.2B or a 4.1. And again, very, very limited business uses, but again, increasing the density up to 14 units per acre. Area C, again, another bigger area. The suburban residential area, this area here, and the urban residential, again, this could be a split. We have a split zone where we've got a more 2.5-story density with very limited uses, where on the urban residential side, and that's really close to the general business district, where we look at a real traditional T 4.2.
Can I ask a question? I was wondering about this map. In Exhibit C, it seems that they've essentially taken those areas that are currently residential and pulled them into this transition, as well as some areas within the industrial area and the general business area that currently have residences, so it makes sense to take them out. However, along Manley Road, in between the proposed area to be rezoned and the general business area, there is a small area of urban residential that is left. Is that an error, or is that intentional?
It was intentional because this is what is exactly what is, I think that was, I see what you're saying now. This piece right here is left out.
Is it intended within the comp plan that become general business?
Let's see, let's take a look at that.
I just asked because to me that seemed to be quite a discrepancy. I mean, the rest of what happened there sort of made sense, I think, with regard to the concept
Yeah,
of...
so I think that's one thing, Mr. Chairman, that we could clean up. I would want to take a look at the comp plan and see how the comp plan lays that out. And
According
then,
according to the map here, John, it is orange, which would mean general business.
okay. So this is just a mapping error then? It's existing is, okay. So that's just a mapping error then that we just need to clean up on the
Okay,
GIS?
I think when it comes to public hearing, we'll just want to make sure that we have those sorts of things
Yep.
squared away.
And John, was that little square an exemption in the suburban residential?
Yeah, that's an existing business, so we're looking to exclude that.
Yep.
And so is that business then not allowable under the various form-based codes?
It depends where we land. If we do a modified 4.0 or something like that, T-4.0, and we don't necessarily consider businesses in that particular form-based code, then it would not be allowable. So we're saying that let's identify it.
And is there a definition of T4.0?
There is no necessarily a definition, but I have an example here that we could take a closer look at, but essentially what it does is it eliminates a lot of the business uses.
Is the business that's there, I'm going to assume, not allowed under the current suburban residential?
There could be some spot zoning there specifically. There's been some spot zoning through the city that they had done previously, intentional.
I guess, having seen things like this before, I would feel more comfortable the next time it comes before us, if instead of simply excluding that, there be a determination as to whether or not you would like us to look at that as a neighborhood business zoning, which is traditionally what we use. For instance, prior to changing Hampshire Street to form-based zoning, Gowles was required to have a neighborhood business zoning district, as was Heathcote's and so on and so forth.
We, very similar in Area A, there's 3 additional areas in that as well. So those as well would be neighborhood business zoning?
I think that we at least need to be made aware of it, and traditionally we use the neighborhood business zone to kind of make sure that those neighborhood businesses can be maintained. So I think that needs to be a part of the discussion, that it is possible that we're creating nonconformance, and how do you deal with that?
Okay, next one here. A lot of this is general business, urban residential, and multifamily. This one here is really looking at switching it all over to a traditional T-4.2 or a variation of that, where we land potentially maybe at B, where some of the businesses are limited. I would probably lean against that because a big area of this zoning is already general business, and there potentially could be businesses in those areas, and if we got rid of the businesses in those areas, we would create some nonconformance on that. Or we have to identify them as neighborhood business zoning individually, identify those for the board, and make a recommendation that we exclude those individual lots that are in this zone.
Yeah, I have a question about that, John. What we're looking at is Bob and Brook there, correct?
Correct.
And north of Bob and Brook, it's currently general business. That's, of that large parcel, 93 acres is owned by the YMCA, and I believe another 30-plus acres is owned by Concord Insurance Group. Few houses towards the northwest of the lot, one off of Stetson, but not really, that whole parcel doesn't seem to jive with what we're looking to change it to, at least from my understanding. So I guess I'm questioning that.
Well, since Mr. Dubois is bringing it up, I was going to wait. However, in Area A, so as it turns out, this is a part of the city that I'm quite familiar with. I grew up actually in the urban residential area highlighted here. And also had a house on Broad Street prior to my current house. And I had a similar question with regard to following Broad Street out into the rural residential area. It is vastly different. One cannot even say that it's a residential area. I live in a rural residential area, and I think out on West Auburn Road, and I think my neighborhood is probably has a higher density than that stretch of Broad Street out to Witham Road. So I sort of was questioning why we would consider a change there. So just to echo, you know, if we're gonna start asking about why certain areas were brought in, that is an area that I had a serious question about.
I'm going to second both those.
Yeah, and I
Like-
think,
Yeah.
and I think when we were first talking about it, we were talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe I should phrase this as a question. So I'll add a question mark at the end of this. But really, the purpose is, the plural of the zoning change is, one is that we have current lots that are non-conforming, and by changing them, we're calling it like it is.
Right.
I think we used the term of 70% of this zoning changes would be to do just that. At least that's how I understood it. Another reason was for infrastructure purposes. We had water, sewer, the proper roads, all of that. Are there other reasons that are driving this that we should be thinking of as we have this discussion?
Yeah, those are good questions. We are aware, and we can take a look at that too, where the public water and public sewer is. Some of these areas are not serviced by public water or public sewer. But the thought process is to bring up, once you change the zoning and you bring up the density, it allows for the development to occur in those areas where it makes financial sense. So that's another reason why it's driving, we're looking to drive the zoning up in that area.
Can I clarify that? Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to make sure I understand what's going on. I would have further clarified that for myself to ask, was part of this in order to be able to take advantage of infill that we can't currently take advantage of because of zoning? This doesn't quite seem to be infill. And I understand the concept of if you build it, they will come. That is to say, if you encourage, there's such a thing as infill, okay, but there's also building at the proximal edges. And so I absolutely understand and respect the concept of building at those proximal edges as a strategy to extend city services. After all, the city is, or not the city in this case, but Auburn Water District is highly unlikely to run 3 miles of sewer pipe in order to service what becomes a node of residential development that is disconnected from other development. That is precisely why I worry about such a large change, and why we aren't doing it as more of a proximal change or possibly a zoned change, to say perhaps the city does value additional residential dwellings. I'll use specifically this along the Broad Street corridor. With that, we would want to do it in such a way that we don't create nodes. Specifically, I think to myself of a more recent, I say recent, as far as the city is concerned, recent, the Woodbury development, which ended up creating, I think, a little over a dozen homes, beautiful homes, all on private sewer and water. My assumption is that we would be looking to do something similar, but do it in a more responsible way, such as connected to the city services,
Right.
water and sewer. So
So that lends itself right smack in the face of subsurface wastewater law, where the minimum lot size is 20,000 square feet. So I think that as a board, a starting point is a density, that is certainly less than that. So in terms of square footage, that way there, we don't get the individual, like you said, nodes of development, so they can put a big engineered septic system or i.e. individual septic systems in a particular lot. So that's why we brought up the T 4.0, where really it's the formation and the density that will drive the new infrastructure of water and sewer. And, hopefully they do it in such a way that it's, what makes sense is the first lot that's available, and we're sequentially working our way out from what's currently urban residential and some rural residential that has sewer and water right now, and extending that in an outward fashion, so in a southerly fashion for this particular
So I know you
area.
meant this to be a question and answer kind of dialogue. So I'm going to follow up and ask, I know that we have contract zoning available to us under state law. I know that it needs to be paid attention to very carefully so that one does not enter into spot zoning as opposed to contract zoning. I personally would like to hear about how that concept of contract zoning could be applied in a situation like this, so that we ensure that there's infill at the terminus of city water and city sewer, to extend that, so that perhaps there be a threshold, like once a specific density is met and those city services are extended, then it would kick into, okay, now it can be extended a certain amount. I guess, so I would like to hear what kind of mechanisms we have available to prevent. I throw that one out. I'm sure there are others. Just to prevent that idea of, okay, well, city water, city sewer ends here, but as a developer, I'm able to purchase a piece of property that's large enough to do what I want to do, but it happens to be 5 miles down the road. So I'm unlikely to say, well, no, the right thing to do is to build right at the terminus of, and not that that's the right thing to do. As a developer, that's probably not the right thing to do. The right thing to do as a developer is to maximize potential of a property. So it's sort of balancing those two sometimes competing needs and desires between developers and the city, and how we make sure that we kind of bring those into step with each other.
Yeah, I guess also when I look at this area A, I'm looking at South Main, that area on South Main that's rural residential. On some of it's low. No, that's Broad Street. South Main is to the east. It's right here.
Okay.
Broad Street, where there's basically nothing. There's essentially no houses there. So why choose that instead of that? It's the same rural residential.
You know, while we're at it, you know, it sort of perplexed me as to why, yes, that is a much denser corridor than Broad Street, but more to the point, I think we have some semblance of a development beginning off of South Main Street adjacent to the overpass over the turnpike, which is abutted by a large, open, very buildable property that also happens to be surrounded by houses. And I'll be quite frank, I'm talking about the golf course that is no longer a golf course, that has houses all around it. And so it did sort of jump out to me as well here that if we were going to eventually extend city services, it would also be a good idea to extend city services to those areas that probably have a need, i.e. the development area that's adjacent to the turnpike, as well as the development that's happened around the golf course, but also to a potential area that has been discussed for years since it stopped existing as a golf course, you know,
And
as a
I would-
possible site.
Yeah, I'll also add that actually is pretty close to the Vickery Road piece here, right? So you could start to fill toward Vickery Road. But sort of pivoting a little bit, but staying with this, how many of these choices, particularly in this area and the Vickery Road section, are actually driven by the hope? I think it landed in the comprehensive plan. It was certainly part of the conversations for a turnpike exit.
That's exactly
Like-
what I was just about to bring that up.
If that's the strategy, then I still don't, if that's the strategy, fine. I still don't understand why that particular chunk of rural residential was chosen as opposed to going out South Main and filling toward the river, toward that Vickery piece.
I think that's a fair question, and that was what was in the comp plan. We can go back to the original notes when they made the modifications of that, and that could be something that the staff reports back to the board on its reasonings.
I hate to do this to staff. I know we're throwing a lot at you.
It's all right.
If you are able to possibly make note of those things that we are asking about, and not to add more work, but to be very upfront and clear with us the next time this comes before us. Hey, last time there were some questions about this, so that we are all aware. Here are some answers with regard to that, but specifically, this is how you will have to affect the comp plan as currently written in order to be able to. I think that's going to be important for us to understand.
Is there any feeling or opinion that we should draw a line here and not make those assumptions and not try to move those forward? I mean, I think that's an option as well, but
So
it should be part of it.
The comp plan does plan for us to try to get an exit off of that, even if it takes more DOT permitting and stuff like that. But I think it would be helpful to know, and again, it's obviously vary in the future, but where the potential turnpike exit would attach into the Vickery neighborhood. I think that would help with these decisions, and also, from what I thought I understood, the point about South Main versus Broad Street, I thought that the point raised earlier that South Main being denser would fit with where that potential exit was targeted.
yeah, and it puts houses closer to that location, thereby making our argument to the Turnpike Authority, because that's the issue. There's no housing there, so they're like,
Right, we've got to
don't
increase
need
the
it.
density in those locations.
yeah.
I think, if I remember correctly, that's been what's presented to the board, is that the Turnpike Authority's opinion is that we don't have the traffic or the residential density, or there's no the residential density is not there, the traffic density is not there, industrial density is not there, commercial density is not there. We got to pick one. And if we're talking about residential density along a corridor that's already
Yeah.
dense. And it's worth pointing out that city sewer goes up. So it's already there at South Main Street. I cannot remember if it extends to the. I believe it might actually extend as far as the golf course.
Almost. I think some of that's not. I don't think
Maybe not
Vickery- I
quite
don't think
there, but-
Vickery-
No,
don't
I
think
know the
Vickery's on
house
it.
right before that golf course couple is definitely
Does
out
it
well.
does it terminate sort of at the Vickery Junction? I forget.
It's a
pretty
little
close to
further
it, I think.
past, but I think it's
So I
close.
mean, you know, it's like.
Yeah.
Whereas I'd be willing to bet the Broad Street.
Broad-
No, Broad Street probably ends directly at the
where-
multifamily housing project.
Yeah.
Where Broad Street and Mill meet, yeah.
Yeah, and just, I think you were asking this, John, but when I look at this, I would exclude, as Mr. Dubois suggested, for the northern parcel, that I don't think that rural residential chunk belongs in this. There's one house, maybe 2 houses along that stretch of Broad Street, plus a junkyard. There's like nothing there.
Well, I mean, even at this scale, we can see the difference,
Yeah, you can
right?
see the difference right there.
Yeah, this versus this, yeah.
Are you
And-
gonna, can you add the water sewer to that?
Yeah, I am.
Beautiful.
It's already there.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, there's already a site plan approved, yeah, so.
What is it going to be? What is it? What's the approved site plan?
The approved plan is gotta be from the mid-2000s, maybe late 90s.
Oh,
Possibly, no, you know what, probably
I
earlier than
think
that,
it's the
because
80s.
I remember the houses along Vickery that were part of that being built in the 90s, so it must have been from the 80s,
Yeah.
early 90s, late 80s, yeah.
Some of that land is now in a conservation easement, but there is potential for high-density development in that location.
Well, and we can see here too, right? City of Service extending partway up Vickery.
Yeah.
It
all
makes
of a sudden, you could potentially create a loop, a connection there.
it just seems to make more sense than to try to drive it out Broad Street.
No, this is all good feedback. It makes a lot of sense. I didn't feel comfortable as we were putting these maps together and I was writing some of the discussion considerations, and didn't feel comfortable at T 4.2. Certainly didn't make any sense from a perspective of there's no utilities there, there's no current density there. It just didn't seem like there wasn't any opportunity per se, and this makes a lot more sense as we look at this. And I think there's probably a lot of non-conformance in these lots as we look at setbacks on these in the current zoning.
I can tell you, having grown up on, well, you've almost got it in there. Having grown up on Enfield Street, absolutely. The house I grew up in would certainly not have been able to be built today. I can also say, having grown up in that neighborhood, the neighborhood traditionally was much more in line with what we heard about T42, even when I was a child. That is to say, we had 3 neighborhood stores, a grocery store, and I'm not talking down below the hill. I'm talking up beyond the fire station. We have that still exists, a gas station and garage to fix your automobile. There were seamstresses. I had multiple neighbors that had businesses out of their homes, right? So, to me, that actually really fits well, with setbacks, but also quite literally not even with like an old, 60 years ago. I mean, I'm only 40 years old, right? So I'm telling you, within my lifetime, there was a time when it actually fit 4.2 really well.
So the proposed boundary, just so everybody knows, does, for the zone change, does come along here and follows this path, and then kind of cuts over and includes the multifamily suburban. So all of this is currently already included, just to know.
Can I ask a further question? So, if you go drag the map north a bit. So drag the map north, so we are going southerly. So if we stop, you sort of see, I mean, it's, the road's very easy to see because, there's city sewer, but you've got that sort of bottom box. I think it's obvious to see that there was supposed to be a road along the rear that connected that whole neighborhood, right? It was supposed to be sort of gridded. That last street, Ipswich, has a large parcel at the end that, if I remember correctly, actually also has a plan that was adopted at some time in the 80s or early 90s. And so, while we're looking at it, I would just ask staff to go see if my recollection is correct, to maybe enter that into the discussion that if we've already got plans approved directly adjacent within this area that we're thinking about, that areas like that also make sense to maybe not, they may not pass final approval, but at least to include in the discussion. And so what I'm talking about specifically is, so you've got Ipswich coming down. If you zoom in just a bit, you are going to see what appears to be a trail or a road.
Right here.
Yes,
Yep.
and within there, if I remember correctly, there is a plan, an approved plan there as well. So
That
And
is
I-
included in the future land use, that parcel.
it is, yeah. Okay.
It's right here.
So, is what I'm hearing, to clarify, that one thing that might be helpful for next time is to go into the areas where doing the T for whatever we choose, zone change, could be a stretch, like rural res or general business, and see what the possible feasible alternatives are, or to see why we adopted those from the comp plan? Or is there...
I'm not so convinced that, and maybe I don't understand it enough, so I'm open to clarity, but the T42 has been scrutinized pretty well, but I'm not so sure it's a T42 problem as so much as a communications issue. You know, we've heard people resist it because they're concerned that a factory or a McDonald's on Fairview Avenue was one comment. That's not what T42 is. So I'm not so convinced that what T42 isn't what we should be talking about. What we're talking about is if, you know, on that parcel right there, if we take out the land north of Auburn Brook and keep it general business, well, the rest of that would seem to fit T42 as T42 is defined.
Right.
So, and as we look at New Auburn, you know, if we take out the areas that are not supported by infrastructure or can't be justified by future infrastructure on South Main Street, like a turnpike exit, then I think it still falls all within a T42 definition.
I would tend to agree, and I would love to hear how everyone else on the board feels. To me, it seems that it is reasonable to think about extending form-based code into those areas, but that those areas represent such a fundamental difference that they either need to be excluded from a discussion of purely T42, or I think what we need to do is think about which areas fit T42, understand that beyond that, our choices are either to say we're recommend nothing else, we will amend the comp plan so that nothing else is recommended, or we say it's reasonable to see growth in those areas, but that there be a somewhat separate standard. So I'm hearing what staff is saying, that there might need to be another tool that we can use, but I would also tend to agree with Mr. Dubois that that tool needs to be used in those areas that don't actually fit the T42. I mean, New Auburn fits T42. The rural residential corridor going down Broad Street does not, right?
Yeah, and you know, if you go to the discussion considerations, I think I'm trying to kind of draw that out of you guys, and I think you guys hit the nail on the head. The only one not knowing was that general business area that I didn't know the ownership and the specific understanding of that land. But it would make sense to me where that could merge as T4.2.
So
If we're just discussing neighborhoods that fit the T42, I would, my opinion would be that area C really doesn't. All those houses are single story, or almost all those houses are single story houses. I don't see where 16 units per acre would be. Again, we don't have a definition for this other T40 or .1, so it'd be hard to say what that it would fit in. But if we're going to say what fits T42 of the 4 sections, this one, the houses are all very small, single-family houses.
I think that leads to a good discussion, which is it is imperative for us to identify, look, there's the comp plan, and I believe I was absent for the future land use meeting. What I think what's happening is we are seeing now, okay, this was adopted. Now as we start looking at it in its particulars, saying, okay, there may be something that we still can get behind, or perhaps we need to amend something. So I think it's a good discussion of A, where does it already fit? Because I think those are the areas that we really should be able to move ahead with minimal issue. I think the more difficult discussion, and I also think being able to identify areas that we want to exclude easily is quite easy. I think we will need to enter into discussion about what are the areas that we as the planning board, looking at the way the comp plan is set up and how city services are currently built out, what are those areas that make the most sense for growth? Because I think the reality is that the comp plan as a guiding document is quite clear in that one of its main narratives is to create residential growth. One, increase density and infill also. So I think we need to take on that charge as the planning board and say, okay, that is a narrative of this guiding document. Where is it that should happen, right? So I think that's an important thing that you brought up there, Mr. Bergeron, is to say we need to be able to identify areas to say perhaps we look at this and we say it really makes no sense there. It needs a different zone, or we say no, you know what, it doesn't exactly fit the current description of T42, but the reality is this is where it makes the most sense to have that. Like, can we see city services like water and sewer there? And I apologize, you were going to say something, Mr. Link.
No, yeah. So I'm totally listening to all of you guys. So A, I hear you say like create residential, growth. But then Brian, maybe I misinterpreted what you said, but I feel like what I heard you say was there's an element of education behind this zone, and with that comes insight into exactly what it is, right? So I'm hearing one thing from, and I agree with you, right? Like, so truly what are we trying to accomplish by this versus a little bit with you, Evan, saying like, okay, these are zones that we want some growth in. There's zones that potentially we have some question about growth. And if we have question about that growth, we have to understand exactly what the question of that growth is, right? So you've got a zone, you're questioning whether what you want in that, you have a zone, you're questioning the growth in that zone. I feel like you have to have some education about what that growth is, kind of to your point.
Yeah, so that parcel above Auburn Brook, I'll use as an example, that Stetson Road has water sewer, which would tend to lend it to what we're talking about, but it also has three-phase power, which to me speaks of general business. There's other businesses on that road, so again, I would eliminate that. However, I think one of the big sticking points for this whole topic is really understanding what T42 means. And as I understand it, and I look at the Manley Road area, the first thing I'm drawn to is the whole idea that, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So this is the density that we're talking about in 4.2. So we might as well call it 4.2. But I don't see a whole lot of room or opportunity for infill here, which to me is another educational moment, is that just because we call it 4.2 doesn't mean that all the developers are gonna come running with their shovels and start developing tomorrow, because there just isn't the opportunity to do that. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think so. We've mentioned that many, many times where, when there's these small lots and they're beautiful, well-maintained homes, people, developers don't come in and buy those homes, tear them down, and then build the to the density that the zoning allows. It just doesn't make any sense in terms of cost. But there could be opportunities as we look at each of these lots closer for the infill piece that we're really pushing for. And that's where the biggest opportunity is, I think, in this particular case, on these house lots that we're looking at here.
But even on an infill, because they're all relatively modest-sized lots.
With the exception of the horse farm.
Yeah, so another question would be, is there a T 4.3, right, that represents that kind of neighborhood?
Maybe that's where I was getting at 4.0. That's a new one.
Yeah.
Again, numbers wise, the lower the number, the lower the, not, the density isn't quite as high. I think that would make sense sequentially.
Okay.
4.3 might be something that's got more increased density versus 4.2.
My personal feeling is this. I think, having watched us as a board discuss this, I think that we will go in circles until we are satisfied that we have the tools to be able to do what we're being asked to do. I think, for myself personally, I feel confident with regard to 4.2 within the areas closer to downtown. Having been on the planning board when form-based code was developed, I also understand that form-based code is very similar to a traditional concept of density, in which you have nodes or zones of density, and as you move away from them, you create less density. By the time we get this far out, we are really starting to reach away from our downtown. I think that it would be difficult for someone to argue that area as downtown Auburn.
Is
And-
that one of our criteria? Or
It's-
is,
I was thinking the same
or
thing.
is it
Thank you.
infrastructure?
That's an excellent question. I think it's a criteria of utilization with the form-based code. So it's one of those things where,
It's, the center out is also a fundamental planning concept for Auburn, right?
it is. And
Yeah.
so we could certainly say, we just think that this can fit anywhere. I think if we don't give ourselves an additional tool, what we run the risk of is sort of almost like creating corrals, for a lack of a better term, where we almost do like what we did with strip zoning, where we run this one type of thing very far out, surrounded by dissimilar areas, and then we have to try to figure out how to fill things in. Whereas if we can more thoughtfully, quite literally fill in moving out, of course, we need to think about city services, but I don't know. I having been involved with the adoption of form-based code to begin with, and I guess I misspoke when I thought maybe it would be best for the board. I'm clearly, I think, speaking for myself at this point, possibly. I would prefer to have an additional tool. That is
And-
to say, an additional tool similar to 4.2 that is similar to the downtown, that represents the neighborhood, the density of neighborhood, but that is dissimilar in some ways to the downtown itself.
So
Just have a
by
quick
tool,
question. What do you mean by tool?
Yeah.
I just want to know the definition of that.
Every zone in our book is a tool that we have to be able to identify what we want built where and how we want it. So when I say tool, I'm specifically talking about an additional zone.
so as this suggested 4.0 or 4.2B
for
or
instance.
whatever it is.
Can I, do you mind? No? Scroll down just a little bit. So if this is downtown, we've got this halo of infrastructure is identified by the water sewer. Oh. John?
We know you're shy, Mr. Dubois.
It's probably for the YouTube that we're. I think it's probably for the YouTube that we have on.
Hello.
I think you have to put your mouth closer. Just kidding.
Hello. So if we're talking inside out, we're talking really infrastructure driving that. So I'm looking at this halo of infrastructure. Probably won't be a perfect halo, but maybe a finger, fingers going on Lake Street, all that jazz. But really, for all intents and purposes, we're not extending beyond the current infrastructure. And that's kind of the purpose, is it not?
Yeah, that's a driving force of the comp plan, is to utilize existing utilities as some of the development potential or increased densities, certainly.
I think the bigger question for me is, are all areas that have access to municipal water and city sewer the same as, the top of Goff Hill? I mean, like that's clearly downtown. Would I expect to see the same thing at the far edges where Manly and Hotel intersect?
And I guess
It's a question that we need to answer, I think, right?
I wanted
I
to
feel like they're very
add on to
similar.
Mr. Dubois' point, if I could, that halo there that he just described, where the infrastructure is, part C here is just outside of that halo. That's why I didn't see it as being a T42, but if there is going to be a turnpike exit coming off right above it, I imagine that it would incentivize the sewer and water to get out that way if there is going to be more development. But with it not being the case, and since we hope to, but it's in the distant, I would say, future of the comp plan, that's the reason I didn't think that section C would fit.
Are you talking about Vickery Road?
Yeah,
It's got sewer, I think.
It does. It has one of the. It was purple and blue. It had one of the two.
Yeah, it's got sewer. Purple is sewer.
Area A, I think you're referring to Area A.
No,
Area C on the packet.
Area C is Hotel Manly, and that also had city water,
then
city
it's
sewer.
the Vickery Road section, I think, is
Yeah,
what.
I'm sorry. My packet's the Hector and Carrier Court.
Area A.
Area A, yeah. Yeah, so, Mr. Bergeron, you talking about Area A being the exception because of the turnpike exit, or are you saying?
No,
even
I
though-
would guess I was circling back to so the comp plan says to develop where there's infrastructure there, and also from the center out.
So it's Area B.
Is it Area B? Why is it? I'm just at the bottom of my paper. It says Area C. You're right. I'm sorry. It's Area B.
Area
but
B.
it's, the maps on that next page. Area B was what I was talking about. But a potential turnpike exit, which is also something we are trying to plan for in the comp plan, would shift that center a little bit, and I imagine there would be infrastructure built out that way. But just as currently situated, and combined, it does have the water but no sewer, but combined with the sizes and styles of houses, it seems like T42 doesn't fit that B section that we had in the packet.
What are the pieces of T42 that you believe don't fit? I think that would be the next question.
Well, I guess, so to increase density, we would want to have built, infill and more building. If you go through those lots and those lot sizes, there's not a lot of, those would be buildings that would have to be, I imagine, removed. You couldn't renovate those into multiple apartments. Those are all single floor, single family homes. So I don't know how that would be useful for infill, I guess. The increase in density doesn't seem like it has a point to it.
I think it probably speaks to the first piece, which is also bringing areas into conformity, because there's multiple goals, I think, going on.
Right. Well, I would add one thing for me that doesn't work for that parcel and the Manly parcel for 4.2 is the 3.5 stories versus 2.5 stories or whatever. So that would be really out of sync with those neighborhoods. If if there is a parcel, I don't know, but if there is a parcel in there somewhere that could be built and somebody puts in, a 3.5 story apartment building, it doesn't really conform to the rest of the neighborhood, which are all single family, maybe 1 and 2 story homes.
All right, so I think this brings up a great point, because it's one that I've been wrestling with, and I heard Mr. Cousins refer to it, and of course, he said it, but how I interpret it might be two different things. But we're talking about defining, what's the term? Like neighborhoods. Help me out. Is a term for it. But, his point was, it's all residential. It's not residential versus industrial or versus big box retail. So I would like some clarity on what the actual definition is to set up like homes, because if by definition, a 3.5 story apartment building fits, and we're all talking about the same thing, then we should all know that. But obviously, the obvious example is if you want to put in a 50,000 square foot factory, obviously that doesn't fit. So I think it's important for all of us to understand what is like build.
Yeah, so I'm
All right,
just
so
going to
that's-
jump in here real quick and say the same thing. So what I heard you say, Matt, was two-story families, right? And then you jump to what would feel out of character for the neighborhood would be 2.5 to 3.5, which to me, from a percentage-wise, maybe doesn't feel. But then you're saying something, you're like, you want a little bit more definition around what that means, right? Like, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking at those areas and saying, in those two areas specifically, I think some of the New Auburn stuff actually already has things that are higher than 2 stories. But in
So
those
do you
areas,
feel like maybe adding like 3.5, like you said 3.5, that would feel out of character for you?
I think so. Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
I'm going to go
Is there-
back to my question earlier, which is, we are the planning board. So when I think about that, that means that you are planning. You are not the identifier of what is right now and making sure that always stays the same. You are not the do whatever is asked of you by whoever comes in front of you because you are asked. You are the planning board. Is
How
incumbent
much
upon
of
us
that
to-
is even?
to plan.
Sorry. How much of that 19 acres is even? I mean, when I was looking at it on the map, there wasn't even a lot of parcels that would be able to build.
There's probably not a lot there. That is really just a recommendation.
Right.
out
Like
of
I
the-
just don't. Yeah.
Out of the comp plan. But I think we got to go back to what I think Evan was alluding to earlier, though, is that we've all looked at these maps now for a while and talked about them. And it's good to have this open conversation, and I'm really we're getting a feel now, I think, that we could start at the top at Exhibit A and start drawing lines where things don't make sense, right? Like, if we want to concentrate, let's move the needle forward on what makes sense as a board to push the council. And I think I'm hearing some really good feedback from you guys, and this is the kind of conversation that I wanted to drive, to have you guys openly talk about this. But if we start at the top at Exhibit A, and we look at the rural residential and this low country density residential here, we already looked at this utilities map here, and we know that there's no utility there. Is it safe to say that we could essentially draw a line here and suggest, because again, we talked about adjacency, we talked about character. That was a term that we use. We may have to get away from the term character a year from now as LD 203 comes into play, but that's a whole different conversation. But I think it's important for the city to make that decision now, right? Because we have the authority still. We can still talk openly about it. Do we feel comfortable as a board to at least suggest in Exhibit A, the urban residential and the multifamily suburban area as something that we push forward as a T 4.2, we can call it a B, or we can call it the same. Do we have that feedback from the board?
Yeah, I think that fits, but that was the first question was, if that fits, I think it also fits going down South Main a little farther.
Yeah, and we looked at that closer, right? And we identified all that area that was already included. And then Evan suggested, and we have it in the notes, look at if there's an additional development already that's potentially already has a housing development or was already a permitted subdivision, we should include that or bring that back to the planning board for a discussion. And I got that. I heard loud and clear, and I think that's something that staff owes the board on that, at least that piece of that communication.
And I'll add that with this particular area, going out South Main toward the turnpike and then down toward the river where it works, that to Mr. Sears' point is planning, right? That's the planning board saying, okay, we have identified in the comp plan a desire for a turnpike exit,
And we have,
but we know what we're missing, and here's how we get it.
Yeah, and we have a transportation specialist, Jonathan Labonte is now working for the city, and he could add a lot to that conversation and what his vision is and what the senior leadership is working on that front with the DOT and with the Maine Turnpike. I'd really like to bring him into that conversation and include I do have a slide on transportation in this presentation that we will cover. But I think it is important that we include that in our next round of discussions. But again, I would just want to kind of narrow this down so we get a deliverable product to the council, and as long as everybody's comfortable with that, we could maybe move on to the next slide.
So before we move on, you were asking, let me make sure I understand. You're talking about the concept of developing a 4.2B with regard to this example that might fit in the rural residential area as defined there. Yes?
Not in this.
Or no?
No.
Okay.
Not this.
Okay, good. I guess I think that something like that 4.2B makes sense to push out, as we discussed, along that South Main corridor that already has density and hooking up with developments that are already happening adjacent to the turnpike, in conjunction with the understanding that we are trying to plan for a turnpike exit there. I would be wholly opposed from taking rural residential and changing it to anything approaching T4.2.
Yep.
I mean, they are so dissimilar.
Yep. No,
There's no bridge. There's no bridge to run that gap. I mean, that gap is huge.
We're on the same exact page.
Okay.
I'd just like to add one thing, because I think it's going to be critical, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I will. I think education's a big part of this. I think we really have a communications issue, not about agenda items, what we're discussing, but defining what we're talking about. When we talk about commercial, people's perception of what that is a McDonald's on Fairview Avenue, and that's just not the case. So, there's something that's got to be done as this rolls out to help people connect the dots on what that really means for their neighborhoods. It might mean a seamstress, but it doesn't mean a McDonald's.
Right. And I think we can look at the past in that regard, and I think we've got some good slides and Evan might have been here when they did that, but they did some really good what neighborhoods look like and kind of the conformity of and the formation of the form-based codes from the inner core, and kind of layering it out there as what that may look like. And it certainly does not represent a strip mall or anything like that, where it's really a mixed use and really densely packed residential areas with a little bit of business kind of sprinkled in there. And I think we've got some good slides that could show that and present that information accurately.
So with the T4.2, isn't some of the lower New Auburn already in T4.2 zone?
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
So how long I obviously knew, but how long has that been in place?
About 2018, 19.
Yeah, and there's still, it's still the same.
We have the most beautiful lot that
Right.
the city has spent a lot of money on, and we still haven't got a developer there to develop the land. Right on the river where it comes into, the Little Andro comes into the Androscoggin River. It's gorgeous. And the city spent, $1 million building the site up. They've got a park in front of you, just seems prime for development. And they built it up out of the floodplain, and it's just ready for a pad and for 4 stories to go up and to build. And we haven't locked anything in yet. It's been that way I've been here a little over a year, and there's been no movement on that. So even though we have the changes, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and some creativity. And this is the biggest piece about the zoning is the creativity piece. This allows the creativity to happen. Once somebody sees how somebody does something, then it gains the momentum and things tend to happen a little bit quicker at that point.
From a transportation perspective, the South Main Street makes a whole lot more sense too, because Broad Street really doesn't get anywhere except back to like Washington Street and a loop. South Main Street gets you all the way out to the Turnpike pretty quickly, or anywhere east of that too, in there. And it's a better road. The infrastructure is already set up to go there. Assuming you can extend services towards the golf course and the Turnpike
And there's a
things like
bus line.
that. What?
There's a bus line on South Main Street.
Yes.
Speeds past my road every day.
And it seems like you could have different areas with either larger buildings that don't fit in the sort of that northern part, the high parts of New Auburn that are really single-family parts, but could have some changes along the way to fit more, to increase the density and access to everywhere, especially if there's a turnpike exit.
Good.
My last thought, I swear, on this topic. Because public perception is that all of this development is going to happen overnight and negatively impact traffic, it would be great to have Jonathan, whomever, to have him share what our traffic plans are. Particular, I'm thinking Court Street. I think it's been difficult for people who have lived here a long time to realize that Court Street is a major artery out of the downtown. But that doesn't mean that heavily trafficked artery needs to be traveled so quickly. So what, we do nothing, I'm afraid bad things are gonna happen. That doesn't mean it can't handle the traffic, just how does it handle the traffic? Be nice to hear about that.
Yeah, and there is a slide, we'll cover it tonight. We'll talk a little bit about it in general terms, but I can say that, Court Street, we are working on, pedestrian movements on Court Street in terms of potentially new crosswalks. We're entertaining road diet, so what that means is, shrinking it down from 2 lanes down to 1 lane and creating parking. So we can get the feeling of the road tightening and people slowing down in that area. And the biggest thing that's rising to the top in those conversations with DOT is safety. Jonathan's got a map, and I just saw it briefly in some passing bys, but the high crash locations on Court Street is frightening. And I think that the council is very supportive of the new work that the safety projects. We're leveraging some safety funds through the DOT, particularly on Turner Street and in front of the YMCA, and building a new sidewalk there, and other projects that they're thinking about doing. But we're really bringing that conversation to open ourselves up to a fair amount of funding that's coming through the DOT. So, yeah, I'd love to have him come here and talk to you guys about what we're working on and what some of the projects that we're doing. He lives and drinks traffic, and he'd have a lot to say for sure.
Yeah, so I'll just say to Brian's point, then greater transparency into it, because I feel like this is the first that I've heard about that. So I think that from my perspective, yes, transportation and traffic has been on the forefront of it. So if we can have more of that as part of the dialogue, that would be great.
Okay. So moving on to Area B, what's some of the feedback that we're looking at for this area? This was kind of an isolated area. It does have public water, public sewer. there isn't a whole lot of lots that really lends itself to a lot of additional development, but there could be, again, some potential there, but not, it doesn't look like a lot.
My sense is that as a standalone, this small area is unlikely to help us achieve our goals unless it is connected to the area that was presented in exhibit area A. They're in very close proximity. That doesn't mean I'm sold on connecting it, but to me, it seems that without that discussion, I mean, I guess earlier in this meeting, I multiple times discussed how I don't think that we should be more thoughtful than we have been in the past to avoid those nodes of development out. And to me, without being connected in, this is doing exactly the thing that I think we ought not to do. And that's my personal feeling, but.
Although, is this just essentially a name change for the zone? I mean, I hear you, I take your point, but it's already urban residential. It's already one of those nodes.
It is already one of those nodes, and I guess I think to myself, I would, for the time being, leave it as its own little island, unless we are going to talk about how we want to responsibly tie it into the bigger piece.
Unless we're going to plan.
Right, unless we're going to plan how it gets connected, right? Yes.
Anything else? Moving on to Area C.
To me, Area C represents the exact lack of planning that I was discussing earlier, because you've got residential zones that were stuck in the middle and in between general business and industrial, right? So that does not mean that I don't think we should do this here. I just say this right now to highlight that, like, this is what happens when you don't plan. When you simply say, there are houses there, so we will just call that residential, right? That's what occurs.
Yeah, but you're willing to keep Area B, right, that urban residential, you're willing to keep that there, but you're not, I feel like, are you willing to change that urban residential to 4.2 in Area C?
I am, because of its adjacency to general business, which also allows for residential uses that are similar to that of 4.2. General business obviously allows for business.
So then my question would be, then why is Area B considered to be urban? Was it considered for a 4.2 would be my question then.
I have no idea.
Yeah, and I can only make an assumption. I didn't make that particular map, but I can say that most of the urban residential, we were looking to increase density because there was existing sewer and water there. So that's what drove essentially the purple areas that we're looking in the future land use map. That drove that to be those increased densities up to 16 units per acre.
Okay. Out of curiosity, who did decide the 4.2 for this Area B? Do we know?
Does that come out of the comp plan?
It's not exactly 4.2B. It's
I didn't. 4.2 for Area B.
It's not. It wasn't exactly we came up with 4.2 because that was an existing zone that was as close to density and to form that we could get to make, because we're looking at, in particular, from a planning standpoint, from a mapping simplicity, we were looking to reduce the number of zones. And we used an existing zone of T-4.2. That's how we got.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think actually we're having two very different conversations. So I'm just going to back up a little bit, and it's probably my fault. So when I look at Area B, the 19 acres, urban residential, and they want to switch it to 4.2, and now Area C, urban residential, switching to 4.2. Evan was not in favor, no slight anywhere, of changing it, but yet in Area C they are. I'm just confused why for Area B and those 19 acres, why it was decided that it would be a valuable place to change it to 4.2. I'm just curious.
Again, it was the existing densities that were there. It was urban residential. It was existing density that lent itself well to increasing the density in those locations. So, meaning that there was sewer and water there, and there was the availability of potentially having additional infill development in those locations.
And by definition, it's already 4.2, right? If it looks like a duck, smells like a duck, walks like whatever. I mean, that's it to a T, is those 19 acres. It lends itself to everything.
Essentially, that's the thought process. But I'm open to the discussion. I'm not saying it's a hard, this is a hard T.
You know, I'm going to go back to my discussion with regard to that lot. There is some, I don't know the scale on these maps, but if I had to guess, between Area A and Area B, there is a linear distance of well under a mile separating them without knowing the scale of these maps. Having driven the road and knowing this area well, the linear distance separating them is under a mile. So to go back to why I felt it was inappropriate, to me it would not make sense to have an island unto itself within a mile of an area that we felt.
781 feet.
Yeah, okay, so well.
Sorry, 68.
Right. That's what I'm saying, well under a mile, right? So to me, it would make no sense for me to get behind that. I would want to entertain the discussion about how appropriate it is we feel to connect those two together so that it is not a discongruent development pattern. Like, it does not make sense to have a development pattern of A, two separate development patterns, and then go back to A within a linear stretch of less than a mile on a road. It just doesn't make sense.
So so are you thinking that from Area A, you would just draw a line? Because I'm just looking at.
I'm not saying drawing a line. What I'm saying is I would not be in favor of doing it as is, and the only way I could be convinced that it should be, that the area should be zoned to 4.2 would be if we had a discussion and someone was able to make a reasonable argument that it would make more planning sense to connect those, and that it would be done that way, I guess. So that, to go back to the question as to why, yeah.
Well, in order to connect those.
I guess what I'm trying to say is this was put forth to us. So my question would be like, what was the method behind the madness, why they chose that?
I think John is trying to be very nice, and I get the sense that this was included because staff was asked to look at everything that is currently zoned residential and that has a specific density and public services either in it or adjacent, and to present it to us. So I'm not sure, so I am not going to make John say anything more, but I get the sense that it is something staff was simply asked to do, but that they were not necessarily asked to give their opinion on whether or not it was the best choice. They were asked to identify those areas and present them to us. That's my sense.
I mean, this is a workshop, this is what we talk about, but this is ag land that separates the two. That's the biggest challenge with staff, right? So we all been down the ag zone, changing zoning, and that is a rabbit hole that's going to be very problematic in this community. We can create that connectivity, Evan, that you're talking about with 7.5 acres, as I drew out right now. We're talking about a separation of 7.5 acres, and now we have connectivity to that piece of property. Is that better planning? You know, is there potential for infill lots along Vickery Road on the north end? Does that make sense? I think that that's something that's viable for the planning board. If you provide that as a suggestion to go forward, that's an absolute, I'm going to take that as something that we should consider and bring that to the council.
How does that-
I think that's good planning.
How does the property owner feel about that?
I don't know necessarily, but we're talking about planning and creating connectivity and doing it in a holistic way. Creating this piece, and there's nothing to gain. I don't know anything about this landowner or anything like that, but if we're talking about either isolating that, taking that off the list, or bringing those together and to do some thoughtful planning, this could be a consideration. I mean, it's not a tremendous amount of land, but it's certainly, and it takes away from ag land, but it creates that connectivity that we're getting at.
Does it really take away from that ag land? I mean, on this area A, I mean, it's all outlined around the ag land. I mean, so if you just kept going around, and we already talked about maybe not going up Broad Street and using South Main Street, so we could include that little piece around that ag land.
That's something that we could certainly consider. I think that's good planning.
I just think that when we look at these things, they are just so close that in my mind, I either need to say, there is a purpose for this, and the purpose for this is not 19 acres. It is congruity with a larger plan set forth for that part of Auburn, understanding that we know we are trying to create density there because we need it for the turnpike. It's something we've said over and over and over again. Not to mention it's an area where there already is a fair amount of density up to a point. Or else say that 19 acres is not key and important to that goal. And so, yes, we will discuss it, but it does not need to be discussed as part of this piece. It needs to be discussed in the future.
So in effect, then, Mr. Sear, you're essentially saying, what would the plan look like to create more density in this region in general? But so, you know, we have this one piece we're proposing, that's Area A, and we have Area B. But really what we want to know is what's the plan for creating the density we need to get a turnpike exit? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I would love to hear that plan too.
So, for clarity's sake, sounds like you're looking to table those 19 acres. Correct me
Well,
if-
we're not tabling anything right now, but yes.
All right, whatever,
Yeah.
yeah.
I know what you're saying.
We're not voting or anything, but to process a bigger picture, we would put that on hold. And I just wonder if there would be any, I appreciate the bigger vision. But does that mean that needs to be shelved until the bigger vision is created? Or can we include that because it has everything else like the infrastructure, the current density, and then, you know, at future planning discussions, try to enhance that?
So it allows for evolution.
I
What's that?
think
It
that
allows for evolution.
Yeah.
When you create growth, you allow for evolution. Like when you create situations that allow for growth, then growth develops, and then it evolves from there.
Yeah, I think I think to answer your question, that is up to the board. Does the board want to see the plan first and then determine that this would be reasonable to include and enhance the plan? Or does the board want to see the plan including that and be able to make a judgment after saying, okay, well, what would it take to include that in the plan? Is that really meeting the goals of the plan? It's tomato, tomato, I think, right?
So
I guess it depends on how the board wants to approach it.
yeah, I guess what's important to me is if this is indeed desired by the city, that we actually see a plan, right? We can't decide it, like there can't be evolution of whatever's here until we actually see a plan.
Well, and I think we need to define what plan means. For me, plan doesn't mean like plots and
No,
so on
no,
and so
no.
forth. But it means, I would hope when this comes back to us, I would personally love to see what it might look like going down the South Main Street corridor, possibly what it would look like here. But when I say plan, I mean like, so the justifications for doing this are the following. This is how like transportation needs are met. This is density, possible density changes, things like that. I don't know how everyone else feels, but
Yeah, that's where I am too. So
I
not,
agree.
I just said, because there are folks in the room, and when we hear plan, everyone's got a different idea of what plan means.
yeah,
so.
maybe I'd reuse the word vision or something like that.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I'm sorry, Mr. Jakes, were you going to say something? I thought you were going to say something.
Yeah, I got
Yeah.
it. So with what Mr. Sear's saying, so the Vickery Road lot or area, that's 19 acres. If you extended like everything south of Vickery Road, like and connected it into the T42 that's already proposed, is that would that help? As a vision for the future?
Yeah, and I think that
That's-
could certainly be a piece. So far, we've only gone so far as to scope going along the South Main Street corridor. But you proposed, what does it look like if you include everything south of Vickery to the Turnpike, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's what these planning board meetings are for, and we try not to give staff too much work. But if we say, hey, we want to see what it looks like along the corridor, but also what are the implications of doing that over that entire piece of property? Hey, we ask. So I think.
And the other part of the comp plan, though, too, looks at increasing density in some of these rural residential areas. It's not exactly what we're talking about, but it's certainly more, up to 8 units per acre. So there is always that discussion, as we join these pieces together, maybe there's similarities, conformity that's not exact, but similar.
Is there anything else that anyone would like to say about A and B so far? I just want to make sure staff can get to all of them, because we've got area C and D that I know they have questions about as well.
Well, I just was looking at the map on, on the town, and I just don't see why we wouldn't put it to T42. Like, there's not enough, there's no open parcels. I think there's only one. No. Anyway, I just don't see, I'm just confused on why you are kind of against the T42 on B.
Oh, I'm not against T42 in the area. I think T42 fits that specific 19 acres quite well.
Oh,
I don't like the idea of making an island of 19 acres surrounded by ag land and then low-density country residential.
it's not really.
And
though.
you end up with an area C.
Right, it is. Like, that's what it's bounded by. It's bounded by ag land on one side, and is it low-density country residential?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, green
Low-density
is,
country residential,
yeah.
so.
green is
Yeah,
LDC.
We'd have T42 surrounded by the 2 most restrictive zones that we have. It'd be like a 19-acre island. That's why I have trouble with it.
let's,
Area
I think
C?
staff will take a look at the transportation piece and the densities. Take a look at what the surrounding area is in terms of what the comp plan says for increased densities, and come back with a, maybe a different plan of action for that one parcel. I think that's the best we could do. And maybe it is, Brian, maybe it is worth a conversation with the landowner about creating that adjacency and creating that. I think it's worth a conversation to entertain it.
And is that line, I guess it's probably pretty arbitrary for our purposes tonight, but I don't know if you looked at slope or anything to determine why they wouldn't go all the way to Route 136? That top line of that 7-acre parcel?
This piece here,
Yep,
I just drew that.
just arbitrarily,
Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe we follow the stream. There's a little stream right here.
Okay. Oh,
Maybe-
okay,
Maybe we follow that boundary.
Gotcha.
The grade is quite steep, actually. It's
yeah.
pretty intense.
Okay. I just looked at the sewer line and said, why not that whole strip, but there's probably other things to consider there.
Yeah, and there's water here. I mean, to have this loop for water seems like it would be good for development. Potentially. All right, moving on to Area C. What's our thoughts on this? Again, we've got industrial and general business either side of this. We are gonna clean up the urban residential, that one little out parcel there. We'll get that map amendment cleaned up. I think that's just a GIS issue.
Oops.
Nope, I'm sorry.
Right. The strip along Poland Road, based on my map, looks like it ends 2 properties too shy. I don't know if there's a way to zoom in on that.
Is
but
it this,
we've got the Goldthwaite Road. That's where the dry goods, right, am I in the right place? There's 2 residential properties northeast of that. Right, oops, go down, right, you're gonna close. Right?
oh, this one here?
Yeah, so Goldthwaite, how do you say it?
Go with.
Goldthwaite? Yeah.
So there's a potential for additional, this is another out parcel here.
Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about.
Mr. Dubois is pointing out that there's, like, on this map is identified as industrial, but they are actually residential properties just north of Goldthwaite Road.
Map and lot 187-050.
So if we're gonna talk about planning, if we're gonna go to the trouble to process this and think about it, does it make sense to leave those people who are adjacent to a residential zone, who are in residential homes, stranded in the industrial zone?
I'm guessing it's just an error.
Or it's purposeful. We don't know, right? It could be that it could be that the desire was that when those residences age out or are sold, that they be removed as residences, right? So that's a discussion that needs to be had, I think.
Is it these two right here?
Yeah, that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And it looks like there's one on the next street up. I think it's in Brenton Ave.
Is it these right here that you're talking about? Matt?
There's one in there. I mean, you look at the parcel view, it's actually, see the curved road to your left? Yeah, right there. That I think is a residence.
Breton Ave.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question, right? This goes back to the question, right? Planning. is the idea that overtime should be converted to only
Right.
industrial use? Or do we want to maintain that as residential and thereby pull it in? So it sounds to me like staff is probably going to have more of those questions as we have a chance to look at these maps closer, go home, check out the GIS maps now that we have some ideas. So it is, I think staff can probably expect to have questions from that, like that, from members of the board. Why is this line drawn here for this house, but this house is left in general business, or this small pocket is left in industrial, or so on and so forth? Staff may or may not have the answer, but I think those.
Well, yeah, we can certainly take a look at those. It makes sense.
And
We'll come
another,
back with either a recommendation or a question for the board.
and I guess another question would be, is the intended purpose to include the entirety of a parcel, or to make one straight line through these parcels because it's so X amount of feet from the center of the road? Or what's the rationale behind that edge?
Yeah, and again, it was based on the older, the existing comp plan, how they drew those lines and the former zoning. So, that's another consideration. Do we want to go back to at least the property line on those to kind of have some conformity on the whole lot?
And I think generally, that's the goal, is to not, wherever possible, to not split lots or parcels in half with zoning. Sometimes it has to be that way just because of the shape of them, but to try to reduce number and type of zones and the really complexity of it is one of the goals, I believe, of T4-2 in whatever form it takes.
We did look at this with GIS. We had significant conversations with Rosemary about eliminating those as much as we could. But it doesn't mean that there's still some out there that we didn't get every one of them. So.
Yeah, I think that whole southern area, it looks to me, I'm just looking at the parcels and the zoning on, and there are more missing, more things that are in the industrial area than.
Yeah, needs some tightening up there.
Yeah. There's one that looks like actually a corner of the house is in the industrial area and the rest is in urban residential. If that's really where it is, that's unfortunate.
So I'm hearing a consensus from the board that we really should stretch those out to the property lines to make it an ease for.
I think within reason, because some of them run all the way back too, right? Some of them all the way, some of those lots run all the way to the train tracks, and some of them don't. So you have to make a judgment call.
Yeah.
Life with one screen. I'm so used to two screens. Challenging. Okay.
But other than tightening it up, I think it does lend itself to a T4-2 as defined. And again, I don't know how much real opportunity there is here, but to me, it falls into the category of, that's what it conforms to, is a T4-2 already.
Okay.
I'd say just as would be really helpful if I don't know whether this exists, and if it's too much, let me know and I'll do my own research, but it feels like some discussion of what consistent with the character of a neighborhood means would actually be really, really, really useful for both the board and the public to hear. So thank you.
Okay. Moving on to I think it's the last piece, Exhibit D. We've heard some preliminary information about the general business on the north end, where the YMCA owns some of that land. It's a large single parcel there. Any other feedback?
Sorry, just to confirm, you're considering Mr. Dubois' suggestion to remove the general business from that chunk. Is that right?
I think so, yeah, that's what.
To leave it as general business instead of
Correct.
D42? Yeah, okay.
I would like to hear the implications on the YMCA and its use of the property within that discussion. Additionally, I suspect there are no paper streets in the middle of this lot. Catherine, while you are looking for plans, you will undoubtedly come across paper streets that may not necessarily be part of the plan you are finding itself. But if those streets exist as paper streets still, I think that would also be helpful for the planning board to get a sense of where those rights-of-way already exist as well. This parcel with a general business makes me think of this. Occasionally we'll come across these lots or parcels that look like they are giant parcels with no roads, no nothing, and as it turns out, there is already a street grid laid out. It just was never built out. So that could be helpful, I think, for us to know as well, if you come across any of that.
So I don't want to add extra work to your plate, but you know what? I really liked, Evan, your statement around the planning board, right? And planning for the future and the conversation that we've had about this new zoning and the evolution of it. And I really appreciate your conversation around, the consistency and character of neighborhoods. And I have to imagine over time, there's been evolution in neighborhoods where they've evolved, not just from a character standpoint, but there's growth in those neighborhoods that have changed the character of it, but to a degree where it still stayed like intact with the narrative of, or what the culture of the community. So in any possible way, when you're looking at the character of the neighborhood, can we also kind of like pepper in there just a touch, just an ability to evolve our neighborhoods to a point where we can have some growth?
I'm gonna piggyback off of that. I was trying to say something to that effect when I was talking about planning. Is the idea that like it's not our job to just identify what it is now too, right? Like what is it that we wish for this area to be? And like the city is full of those. Historically, New Auburn did not look like New Auburn until it was built as New Auburn. That was quite a long time ago. The old Danville Corner Road, when I was a child, looked nothing like the way it looks now, right? That has evolved. I would argue that was maybe to our detriment per se, but that's because it created one of those nodes I discussed, but it was deemed that that's what the city wanted, and so that's what was planned for, and so that's what was allowed, and that's okay. Again, I look at the entire Amberley Way neighborhood. As a child, that was, very young child, that was a farm, where the high school sits now, we think of as being in town, was an undeveloped piece of land that had originally been slated for development, similar to that on the north side of Court Street. So it's important. I throw those examples out just to say I absolutely 100% agree, and I want to add weight behind that. It's important that we look at those things and understand that planning is planning ahead. I agree.
I think that's pretty much all I've got in terms of the 4 separate lots. This is the overall comments. This is from our transportation person. Demand management, I'll just kind of read through this a little bit. The goal focuses primarily on non-residential development. The scale and scope of residential development warrants a process to expand the transportation network. I think we talked a little bit about this already on South Main Street, an overall impervious area in a sustainable fashion. Creating connectivity. As we think about these developments and we are increasing densities in some of these areas, when you're driving around, think about, well, is there sidewalks there? Is there connectivity? Do we have opportunity for connectivity? If we're creating some of this infill development or, adjoining large masses of concentrations of development and we have a patchwork of land that's available and there's nothing in between, what is the opportunity there for connectivity? I think we really need to focus on that as a planning board in terms of any new development coming in front of the planning board to make sure that we're asking for that connectivity. I think that's an important piece. And then road network. Street grids provide for the most efficient delivery of municipal services. Public safety, solid waste, et cetera. And again, that east-west development, street grids, thinking about that as we develop any of the vacant land, how can we create that connectivity in a road network that makes sense for sustainable development? So,
Is that something we can do? Sorry to interrupt.
Nope.
I've been here long enough that the general pattern in the past for infill was to utilize an internal cul-de-sac. It's incredibly common. It maximizes the land available for a developer, but it is horrible for traffic patterns and for the creation of a walkable neighborhood.
right, so if we go back to our comp plan that we just updated, we've addressed that, and we really want to get away from cul-de-sacs. We want to create through streets. We want to create connectivity to neighborhoods and to areas, to downtown. How do we get there? We should constantly be looking, how are we getting there? How are we going to get from point A to point B and make it where it's walkable? My biggest takeaway being in the city of Auburn for the last year is that a lot of the roads are too fast. There's not a lot of connectivity, and it doesn't feel comfortable to walk in the city. And as soon as we start thinking about those opportunities and we create more people walking on the streets, we're going to get more awareness from drivers, and it's I think it just makes for a better neighborhood and a better community. So again, we're going to drive this. I met with the recreation committee. We've avoided a lot of the recreation pieces with site plan review, which is completely legal under the state statute to review projects under the site plan review versus a subdivision, but we lose the recreation piece. And as the planning board, we want to look at when we have a big subdivision that comes before us or a site plan that comes before us and it has housing, what's the connectivity there? We should be asking for something. And we've done that. We did a great job with AR development, the project we just approved. We asked for 700, and the board asked for 720 feet of sidewalk that really connected that parcel to some of the local shopping in the area. This is what Jonathan is getting at on this, is that we really should expect this, and we should ask for it in in a creative way and to think about opportunity. You guys are here, live here in the community, you have that vision, oftentimes better than the staff, and I really like to pull that out as those projects come before the board, to make sure we don't miss that opportunity. If you know there's a trail system or a sidewalk, and there should be some kind of connectivity, we should be looking at a way to get there. That should be part of our planning. I encourage all of you guys to read the transportation system considerations. It was in your planning board packet. It was dated April 27th, 2022, on your own time. I'm not gonna, I just highlighted some of the goals and that considerations. We've heard already from you guys. We owe you some work on transportation on some of those parcels, particularly the one in South Maine, and how that connection to the future connection to the turnpike and how we're going to drive those densities in those areas. I think that was great conversation. But I'm going to leave it at that. We've got plenty of work to do on those 4 zones. You guys left us with a lot of questions and a lot of things to answer. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the comp plan recommendation and the planning board recommendation.
Before we move on, you mentioned it briefly. You said we would discuss it later. As we move forward, undoubtedly we are going to talk about densities because the word was used several times today. And everyone should be appraised of LD 2003 and what it means and what its implications are. And if folks haven't had a chance to check it out, go check it out. In brief, there are several things that it does, but when we discuss density, one of the things we want to be really careful about doing is creating a prescribed density. What LD 2003 does is allows a developer who's going to create quote-unquote affordable housing. So this is, when we say affordable housing, it gets confusing. Affordable housing is not housing that is affordable. It is defined having been paid for a certain percentage of by tax credits to create subsidized housing for folks with income limitations. A developer wishing to do one of those projects in an area is allowed to, by right under LD 2003, multiply the prescribed density by 2.5 times. So just so we're aware of that moving forward, when we think about how dense we want something to be, we're going to have to be very creative about how we define that, because if we say the density is 8 units per acre, that means that a developer wishing to do a low-income housing project, and I don't mean housing project in the negative term, I mean like housing development, let me use that word, a low-income housing development, can now utilize a standard of 18 units per acre. 2.5, so 20, yes, more than 18, 20. So that is going to be, that's a big difference, 8 to 20, right? So I thought we might talk about it. We don't have to necessarily talk about it anymore tonight, but it will come up next time. But that's something that.
Yeah, I think we put that as a topic to discuss. I'm still reading through it. It's a lot to swallow. So for multifamilies, it's 80% above the median income. That's the threshold that they can go up to. There's even a provision in there for single family homes. And that's up to 120%. So that really gives opportunity for folks, first-time home buyers, to really get into a home. And the interesting thing, it's very similar to what, if we look at planning done in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in the bigger cities like New York City, it's just the income requirements coming in that they have to meet. So if they get in there at 80% of the median income, and then all of a sudden they're making more and more money, they can stay there. They don't have to move. So that keeps that keeps those people, as we do those developments in the community, that, I truly believe that'll keep them here. And I think that's a good thing for the city of Auburn.
Oh, I am in no way making a judgment call about types of housing. What I'm saying is it's important that people understand that, for instance, also in LD 2003, accessory dwelling units do not count towards density. Right? There's a whole list of things that the state is doing that are going to become law in July of next year that I think we all have to understand when we're having these discussions, because we want to make sure that when we are finally sending something to council and we say this is what we want it to look like, we realize what it can look like given the implications of LD 2003. I simply picked density as one of the things in there because that's one of those things that we have discussed, that word density has come up. But it's going to be little things like that that are going to be important, because I don't see initiatives like the one that got LD 2003 at the state going away anytime soon either. So I'm not sure it's the last one we're going to see that affects us. But that's where I was going with that, John. I apologize not to.
No, that's okay. It's good discussion. The definition certainly is something that there's a lot of definitions in that LD 2003 that we really need to truly understand. So it'll be interesting to see if MMA comes up with some guidance for the municipalities to look at. I think that's something that we definitely want to key in on, and then obviously reading it on your own. I'll make sure to get it out to the board tomorrow. I'll make a note to get it out to everybody so you guys have a copy of it. Get a chance to read it.
Thank you.
Moving on to the Lake Auburn Watershed. This basically was a recommendation out of the comp plan, and then in addition to that was part of the recommendation that the board gave to the council, a recommendation that we do these things together. And as I mentioned earlier in the meeting today, the council did table their decision, and essentially now we're here moving this through a workshop. What we're looking at is we're looking at the 1 acre lots that are in the Lake Auburn watershed, and we're looking to increase the minimum lot size from 1 acre to 3 acres. So again, going back to the comp plan recommendation, and for ease of map amendment changes, right? All areas of the low-density rural residential zone in the watershed will essentially become low-density country residential with a 3 acre minimum and 325 feet of frontage. Essentially, it's all these areas here in brown that we see. This purple here, that line that comes down here, this is the watershed boundary. And again, it would include this piece and this piece and this. All said, there's 300 or so lots.
317.
317 in that area. So again, this was with three conditions. First, which states the approval must coincide with the adoption of the zoning change that reduces the housing density. It says all parts of the watershed. I guess that's really specific to the rural residential, as Matt pointed out earlier. Again, 1 dwelling per 3 acres. There's approximately 317 parcels in the watershed under the current rural residential zone. Of these, 66 are under 1 acre, and are currently non-conforming under the current rural residential. This was something that we oftentimes get the question from Stacy, well, how many lots are there? How many are there going to be? We're taking a look at that. We're going to have a number. We're certainly, the FB Environmental looked at this on page 35 of the report maybe referenced 100 lots, right, in the report. And we certainly know by making this adjustment that potential for development goes down. And we're gonna include it in the new model. We'll include the density going from 1 acre to 3 acres. But in addition to that, we're gonna incorporate the low impact development techniques with the ordinance change that we already did. So there'll be some total phosphorus entrapment there on those calculations. And then there's the replacement systems and the new systems. Every one, right, is gonna be required to put in basically a curtain drain, which is considered a low impact development technique, or a diversion ditch. So there, even in those specific, those are considered specific BMPs. We can run a model for that under the Region 5. It's a modeling that runs, the EPA is the Region 5 that ran models for all the 319. So it's Clean Water Act money essentially. And they have to report, the people that get 319 money grants, which Lake Auburn is, they could receive those monies to protect the watershed. They could implement specific BMPs in those areas. They have to report back to the federal government, well, what's the entrapment? By doing riprap or doing a new culvert or putting a crown on a dirt road and building things correctly, creating buffers, well, what's the entrapment of the phosphorus and the nitrogen? So we can calculate that on each of these sites, and that'll be part of the reporting in year 2, 4, and 6. So those things are, in addition to that, those are additional items that FB Environmental is doing. We just contracted with them to run that model for the increased lot size, the additional LID techniques, and the distance from potential development for new septic systems. So there's a few additional items that they're putting in the model. At the end of the day, we go back to the report, and this will be additional information as we bring this to the board, is that there's a target from the FB Environmental report of basically 900 kilograms per year. And that's the target. We're in the 950 range, high 950s, 959, 957, somewhere in that area, even a status quo. And we got to figure out a way, if we're really talking about water quality, we got to figure out a way to get to 900. And I think this is a great way that we get to 900, and we can calculate that on each one of these sites, and we'll run it through the model, and FB Environmental is going to say, okay, as we implement all these things, this is what we're looking at for a number. So it'll be interesting to see where we land, and I feel confident that we're gonna hit some good marks in terms of net reduction in phosphorus loading to the lake.
I have 2 questions.
Yep.
900 kilograms per year. Is that the load within the lake, or is that the load to the lake?
So that's the load to the lake.
Okay.
Yep.
And obviously we're talking about Auburn wearing 2 hats. I know that there's discussion on the watershed side to say that if there are meaningful standards are implemented in Auburn, it sort of, the current standards are difficult to implement because it's just very clear there would be legal challenges given the inadequacies of the current standards. But if there were to be effective standards implemented, it would allow for those to be discussed in the upper watershed, and possibly mandated if those discussions don't go well. leading me to this question. Are we also looking at a situation where the model will include those things for the land area within Auburn, and then also a scenario in which those same standards are implemented throughout the entire watershed?
That's a good question, but that's not a consideration at this time that the city has contracted for.
Okay.
There is some additional monies, though, if we get through this quickly and efficiently with FB Environmental, there could be some additional monies to look outside the city. We're focusing on the city to see what our impacts are, but we certainly are hopeful that we can look outside of the city's boundaries. But it's definitely not my decision to say yes or no if we're looking outside the city at this point. That I
Look,
don't feel comfortable
I get it.
with that.
The city can't look at another city and tell them, this is what we're going to do, particularly if they're not a party to an interlocal agreement that does provide that authority. Again, I wear two hats, so I have personal interest in it as a watershed commissioner, because that's something I would love. And if the city of Auburn is going to fund it, then great. But more
We'd
to the
love
point,
to go to speak to those communities.
yeah.
so.
But more to the point, I also think that it would be worth considering, even just for the city of Auburn. I understand the political issues around that, but I think it would be good for us in making our decisions to understand how much of what we're doing is affecting the lake versus how much of what we don't have locus of control over how that is affecting the lake. I just think it would help us manage as well, right?
I think the biggest win for those communities north of us, and I'm not speaking for the communities, but knowing the topography and the watersheds and how it lays out, the basin is really a big attainment area. So a lot of that settling occurs through the basin, and I think that the report mentions that there's quite a bit of attainment from that. But as I talked to the modeler just last week, I really pushed for what is the impact of these septic systems, right? And she's like, well, it's hard to model those things. I'm like, well, we always use a term, bioaccumulation, or we use the term non-point source pollution, and over time, that enters the stream, and the stream is connected to the lake, and therefore there's an impact. So getting back to the Evans point, even though there's 50% attainment in the basin, there's a net export there, right? And that's bioaccumulating in the basin. And if we really want to look at that scientifically, we should be looking at that and seeing what that net export is out of the basin that affects overall Lake Auburn and Lake Auburn's watershed quality. So that is definitely part of it. It shouldn't be ignored, but it's not part of our scope at this point.
What's the time frame on hearing back from FB?
3 weeks. So we'll have some information at the next meeting. So it's going to be
We'll look at this in June?
in June, yes.
Yeah,
I say
okay.
next meeting. We have a meeting next week.
We've got one next week, yep.
Where we will not talk about this?
We will not.
No, okay.
Oh, that's nice.
John, I have a question because it was raised to me from the agenda. If you could pull up the map. It says were considered changes include changing 3 separate areas of rural residential to low country residential. Could you just, I think you did it already, but could you just, for the sake of carrying out a request, could you just highlight or just point to those 3 specific areas that we're talking about?
Sure, it's this area here, and then this area, and then this area.
Okay.
It was, if you go to the report, Eric wrote the report, He did include a proposed map amendment area. This came out of the original map that I did for the council. I can bring it up here if you want, so everybody can see it, so the public can see it as well.
No, that was just more of a housekeeping thing. I think that,
Okay,
yep.
You're all set?
satisfies it. Yep. On a bigger picture, my personal feeling is there's a significant amount of misinformation out there in this particular topic, so I'm gonna try to summarize it, probably for my benefit more than anybody else's. But we've got this proposal to elevate the standards of the septic system. It's more restrictive to development because we're now increasing the amount of acreage for one dwelling from 1 acre to 3. We're introducing monitoring of these systems, both to support potential funding and to ultimately protect our valuable resource. So far, so good?
yes.
We might have a potential funding source to improve existing systems, right? So all of this is going to end in significantly increasing the protection of our valued resource.
Correct.
Okay. So I guess the downside, if I understand this correctly, is that it could increase development. Albeit restricted and responsible development, it could increase development in that area.
I'm hesitant to say at this point what the numbers are, but we're looking at, and going back again, we've gotten feedback, and sorry to put Stacy on the thing here, but she always asks a good question of what's the impact, what it's gonna be. So we're looking at every single lot and its
Right.
potential.
Right.
We're gonna have that information available to the board at the next meeting in June when we cover this again.
Right.
And we're gonna have not only are we gonna have the development potential by lot, but we're also gonna have a model run with the new standards in it. So we're gonna have a model and what could be built on the face of the earth. And again, we're at 100 right now. The report says 100, and I feel confident we're gonna be less than.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the number, if we do status quo, there's potential, I think there's potential for more development to occur than if we make these changes that we're implementing. Not even looking at the septic systems alone, if we're just talking about pure development potential, there'll be less development potential as we make these changes.
Right.
Because we already have, and a big part of this, we have the ag land and its own restrictions in the ag land. So that in itself is gonna restrict a lot of development in the watershed.
Mr. Du Bois, do you mind if I jump in real quick? 2 things. In reading through the FB environmental study, it's important to note that they assumed any lot that could have a house on it, i.e. 10 acres of ag land, will have a house on it. And I think all of those of us sitting on the board recognize the very low likelihood of that happening. I liked your question. I would like to further it by asking a different set of questions. Are there currently developable lots within the watershed?
Yeah.
Yes. I think it's important to note because a lot of people believe that our current standards prohibit development. They do not. They seriously limit it. So,
And I want to point out, and I didn't finish this slide, and there's 86 lots right now that could potentially have, that if we change this, we're going to make those non-conforming lots. So there's 86 additional lots right there that we're talking about currently
right. So
now.
there are currently developable lots within the watershed.
Right, so
If someone were to develop those lots within the watershed under the current standards, right? They can develop those lots under the current standards. Yes.
Correct.
So go ahead,
Other-
Catherine. I want to hear what you said.
just, so I think if the septic change, it wouldn't make that whole area developable. It would only, if there is like a big piece of land that the only reason that it's not able to be developed is the soil, that's the only thing it would affect. There are still many lots that can't be built out because they're in ag land or because they don't have road frontage or because the density is already maxed out. And if we were to increase it to one dwelling per 3 acres, that reduces it even more. So I think what it does is for any amount of possible, for lots that could not have dwellings on them because of the soil that now would be able to with the septic, coupling that with reducing the density would, I believe, mitigate any of that density change for the watershed. I believe it would lessen the overall change.
Okay,
So-
so back to my question, though. We've established this. If we make these changes, will there be developable, I can't speak it, lots within the watershed?
Yes.
Will those lots be developed under a more strict or less strict environmental standard than currently exists?
More strict.
More.
So I think it's important for people to understand that development can occur within the watershed right now, and if it occurs within the watershed right now, it is done to an environmental standard that is lesser than the standards that are being proposed. That I just want people to be very clear that it can be, there's development potential now,
Yeah.
that the current standards don't prohibit development within the watershed, but that any development that occurs now is done so at a lesser environmental standard than would be done were these to be implemented. That's,
And
Yeah.
can I just follow that for June? I think Mr. Sear has a great point. And for June, it would be really good to know that how many can be developed right now. What is that number? And if we do these changes, what is that number?
No. I was totally thinking the same thing, but I was going to spare John that
FP
cross
environmental
comparison because
identified.
trust me, like I'm all about numbers, and I'm like, you know what? Listen, if I can get a little bit of numbers, I'm going to go with it. But I was there like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly.
FB Environmental identified, I believe, 380 some odd.
17?
317?
No, those are the rural residential lots.
Oh, okay.
We just pulled
No,
it from the
no.
GIS
So
map.
FB Environmental did that in the study and identified that currently there are something like, it was 360 something or 380 something possible developable lots
In the whole
in
watershed.
the watershed within Auburn.
There were I
Currently.
thought there were a lot fewer in Auburn, but okay.
Everyone thought there were a lot fewer in Auburn.
No, I just remember.
But it's because of the methodology that FB Environmental used, which included taking agricultural land, of which the majority of this is, and assuming that a house lot could go on each 10 acres.
Got it.
It's
Yeah.
important, see what I mean? So
Oh, yeah.
of that additional 100 houses, really,
What is, well, yeah, I want to know what that number is. Like, how many we can build today? Like, I'm Elon Musk. I'm going to buy all the lots, I'm going to build on them. How many is that?
Right.
And if we do this change, I'm going to buy all the lots and I'm going to build them, and how many is that?
We have a good handle on what that is.
That's awesome. That'll be great to hear.
Yep.
I'm going to make a meme.
I think we'll wait on any kind of definitive number if we even get one to compare it with the FB environmental.
Sounds like a smart move.
Yep.
but if anyone's interested, they did include those numbers in the study. You just have to recognize what their methodology was and understand that from the outside, there are implications for doing so, for doing it the way they did it.
And the other part of that too is that we're not talking about the septic system, right? So of those lots that could be developed, and we're using the old standard that's 42 years old, and we're short-circuiting into the groundwater and that potentially could enter the lake directly, that in itself is another environmental issue that we're not talking about, that we're correcting through this process. So I think that's a big win. David Roque wouldn't have been here because he's retired. He doesn't need the money. He's here because he was here 15 years ago talking to this community about this, and he understood it, and he believes in it. And, you know, this is a really good step forward for protecting Lake Auburn. And again, we want to figure out a way to get to that 900. Go to the report, sheet 35. I'll share that with the board as well. And let's figure out a way how we're going to get to 900. And I think that it'll be interesting to see what the data is that's coming back from FB Environment.
I think it's important to note right now that staff is not discussing how to keep phosphorus loading under a future number. Also, I mean, I think this is the first time that I've looked at this issue where we are actually talking about reducing the amount of phosphorus load within the lake, which, sorry for interrupting, to me that's important. That is a very big, that is a fundamental change in the way we've talked about protecting our lake in this community. In the past, we've talked about reducing the amount of increase in phosphorus. So like we're trying not to exceed a certain number. And this is the first time we're really talking about saying we can do better than we're currently doing. So I just want to say thanks.
I think another point is, we know more today than we knew 15, 20 years ago about leach fields. You know, it used to be find the sandiest soil you could have, right, and just let it leach. Well, that's not the best plan for your watershed area, is to have sandy soils, because it's not being filtered the way it would be
Right.
under the new design.
That goes back to Dave's comment about we always refer to a perk test. The perk test was how quickly does the water drain out of sight? And that's not, we don't do perk tests, we do soil tests. And there's a big difference between perk tests and a soil test. That's a good point.
And I did sell a house up on North Auburn Road, and we had to replace the whole septic system, or the leach field, and under it, when they were it was literally like wooden boards. Like, it wasn't even, I don't know what was happening there until we replaced it. So, I mean, the designing of leach fields has really come a long way. And I think updating it is just even better.
This isn't a fair question, but there's a strong opposition to this for fear of polluting our water source. But everything we talked about tonight is really protecting our water source. So to me, much like the last topic, we don't have a zoning or a septic issue. We have a communications or a PR issue about getting this information out accurately so people come to understand it and trust it. I don't know how do we make that connection?
You know, again, I think it's public information and it's public education, and as we talk about this and bring it to light, I think more and more people will understand. But again, going back to the original slide that we did in the workshops for folks, we talked about a follow-up at year 2, 4, and 6, and that's part of the science, right? So science is always testing the waters and seeing what the results are. And I think that we're going to have attainable results that we can point to that we ultimately did the right thing for the lake and the right thing for the watershed. So we have a mechanism to do that. We're prepared to do that as staff, as recommended by the planning board to the council. We're developing spreadsheets on, and then talking already about Dave Roque to talk to our code enforcement officers to educate them and the site evaluators and the realtors in the community so they understand what the requirements are and how those are built and how they're implemented and how they're inspected, right? So the inspection piece is really important on that. And we're fortunate to have some good code enforcement officers in Auburn, and they're going to be the ones out there looking at this stuff going in the ground and making a difference and making sure that we have the right media and doing the right thing out there. So there will be some follow-up on this, and that's something certainly we're going to share with the board.
I
All
just
right.
want to add too, real quick, that I just absolutely agree with just like needing to get out the information more, and I think that's something that we'll be thinking about and working on. Definitely really important, and getting more people, hopefully, to come to these meetings and just know what's going on. It's hugely important. So just want to validate that and agree and say that it's going to be a process. I think that we'll get on more.
I think some of the issues that were raised tonight, maybe summarized in a FAQ and put on the website, maybe even the newspaper.
Perhaps maybe even like little small tutorials and walkthroughs. I know it's a lot of social media engagement, but little animated videos goes a long way of showing people, I guess, starting from like, I don't know if they have any foundation or knowledge of it, but kind of guiding them through like a simple step-by-step general direction of the process and the thought process, education and plans going forward.
And even just like the process that has got us to this point, I feel there has been, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's all part of this line that we're still trying to come to the right answer, but we're not at the beginning or the end of the story. We're kind of somewhere in the middle. So I think to have maybe something like that lineage could be a good way to do it. Just thoughts.
Are there any other questions about the workshop items?
What-
All right.
What happens with the parcels that become non-conforming, or some that already are non-conforming? What does it mean for them?
It becomes further non-conforming, so the ability to do additional things with their land becomes more difficult, certainly. And it goes kind of back to where we were talking about some of the things that we addressed under the urban residential area, where you've got some nonconformity that makes it difficult to do something additional. The replacement systems, though, it's not that the house can't be replaced. The house could be replaced. And in the failing septic systems, we do have provision in the language to replace those. And it doesn't necessarily 100 have to meet what the new standard is. It's the best use and what makes sense for that particular lot. But we're looking at least doing the best we can with the conditions that they have for some of these small lots that might not have the land availability to do, fill extensions and what have you on leach fields. So that we have a mechanism to address that with having not only our code enforcement involved in that discussion, but bringing in the Auburn Water District as well in that conversation.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Item number 5 on the planning board agenda is public comment. This public comment is not tied to any specific hearing. So we invite members of the public to come forward, discuss anything they feel is pertinent for the board. We'll ask that you begin by stating your name and address. And our policies and procedures limit public comment to 5 minutes.
Thank you.
I should say
My
per
name is
person.
Bruce Ryu, and I live at 85 Mary Carroll Street in Auburn. And 15 years ago, or 14 years ago, actually, when this same septic change ordinance and was up for discussion, I was president of the Auburn Water District Trustees, and I was also on the Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. And I came to all the planning board meetings, city council meetings, and you're doing a great job. However, 100% of everything that you've said, Brian, what you just said, was said by those planning board members too. It's a better septic system. We're going to be more protective of the water and the watershed. We're going to do all of the things that is necessary to protect the water. That's what we care about, and that's what those people said. So why did the council, the planning board, the district, and the commission vote to not make the change? Not because they were stupid, but because they were fearful. And I think you should still be fearful that if we increase development in the lake, we stand a chance to lose our waiver from filtration. You don't have control of it. City doesn't have control of it. The district doesn't have control of it. The commission doesn't have control of it. It's the Maine Drinking Water Program, and they have their authority by the EPA. They are in charge of our waiver from filtration. Let's say we lose it because we've made a change to the watershed. We've increased the ability to put in more homes, good septic systems, good phosphorus control, but we've made a change. They're going to look into it. So let's say we make the change, they look into it, we lose our waiver. My mouth is drying up. Let's just look at one line item on the Auburn City budget. And I said this yesterday at the city council meeting. One item. $792,716 for public fire protection. Now that's not to buy a fire truck. $792,000 is for the water to put out the fires. If we lose the waiver from filtration, that number goes to $2 million, about 2.5 times what it is right now. That's a guess, but we're going to build a filtration plant. It's going to spend a couple $1 million a year to operate it. So that one line item wipes out all of the tax increase or all of the tax benefit that all of the houses, whether it's 33, 50, 75, no matter how many you put in the watershed, we're operating at a loss. We haven't even sent the kids to school yet, and we're operating at a loss. We haven't picked up the trash either. So 15 years ago when we looked at it, it was a risk-reward. The risk is that we're going to build a lot of houses. And the reward is we're going to get, new housing in the watershed. But the downside risk is we lose the waiver from filtration. Tens of thousands of people pay more for their water every quarter in 2 cities plus Poland. Every single person in Auburn will have 1 or 2% on the city side for higher taxes. So it's not about better septic. It's not about better phosphorus control. It's about us not being in control of the waiver from filtration. That's out of our hands. And if we lose it, we're going to take it on the chin. So it's not that we made bad decisions 14 years ago, because you know what? The lake's still clean. We don't have a septic problem. We've maintained the waiver from filtration for 14 years, from that point to today, and we continue to have it.
Mr. Reeve, we appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
I apologize. Your 5 minutes is up.
That's not a problem, I think I said it. Thanks, Evan.
Is there anyone else from the public that would like to comment?
Maureen O'Brien, 42 Winter Street. I'm wondering, with the, looking at increasing the density of the various neighborhoods in Auburn, does anyone know what the average capacity of water use there would be for each home? How many homes would it take to get to the point where we are reaching the capacity of Lake Auburn to be a water source? That's one of the questions I have with the rezoning.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak?
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Dunn. I live at 530 Court Street. I've heard many times this evening people say that you are planning for the future of our city, and I appreciate all of those efforts. You are an unelected body, 9. City staff, from what I've seen so far, have been 3, Mr. Cousins and Mr. Blay, and I'm not sure your name, I'm sorry.
Catherine.
We have a city council of 8. So in total, we have about 20 people that I've been watching for the last several months, making decisions about our city. 25,000 citizens, approximately. Your decisions affect our entire city. The new ordinances are many and widespread. My question is, when, where, and how do the opinions of the rest of the citizens factor into all of these matters? I agree that we need more education, but we need more than that. We need to feel that we have input, and I haven't seen yet how that happens. I agree that there should be some public forums, but not just for us to come and give comment. We'd like to have an opportunity to ask questions and actually receive answers. We need a voice. Also, I've also heard tonight, let's spare our staff. I'd like to say, staff is our best resource. They're educated to do their job, they're hired to do their job, and we need them to do their job. So let's not spare them. Let's use them to help us do whatever is best for our city. And let's let us, citizens, please have a voice. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wishes to address the board?
Hi, good evening. Jason Levesque, 205 Young's Corner Road. I just, I'm the mayor too, that's my part-time job. I just want to talk a little bit about what I've heard. I've watched your meetings for some time, of course. We're all working together as a city council, as a mayor and the planning board. I just want to make sure it's clear. One thing I haven't seen that's been clear is kind of the fact-checking of information that's presented as fact, when in actuality, it's not. And this goes back to Mr. Dubois' point about public relations. I actually wrote a printed op-ed in the Sun Journal back in November of last year talking about this very same issue. We've been working on zoning and the comp plan since 2019 with our strategic plan. It's been over 3 years of work, actually started before then as well in 2018 and a little bit in 2017 with other studies that were commissioned. This is not something that's been rushed. It's something that was done comprehensively, holistically, and it needs to be. Studies have shown around the country that if you do piecemeal zoning in certain areas, those areas almost always tend to be those that are underrepresented, marginalized communities with a lower demographic. What happens then is a theory called displacement. When those areas become upzoned or rezoned, the people that have lived there that have not been able to advocate for themselves are forced out. Whereas the existing neighborhoods with people who understand the system, the zoning, protect their neighborhoods from any type of growth. That's just one piece of the information that we need to look at. Look at other states. What we're doing here is not revolutionary. It might be for Maine, but it's not nationally. This is the trend. But speaking about information, certain facts. In our budget, we have a line item, $750,000 for fire suppression to the Auburn Water District. That's what we pay. It's a percentage of the water bill we pay to the Auburn Water District to provide fire hydrant services. Go a little bit further. Auburn Water District is the sole charger of water fees. Not every taxpayer in the city would see their taxes go up if we lost our filtration waiver. The ratepayers would see that, yes. But we also have to realize we are subsidizing the water and the ratepayers due to lack of economic development. That's also outlined in the FB environmental study. Keep going down this path. When you start digging into the data, you're also going to realize, excuse me, that the clean drinking water standard, and correct me if I'm wrong, and we have had recent communication, only cares about what comes out of the tap. That's what they judge. I was in Washington, D.C. at the EPA headquarters 3 years ago with scientists from all over the country. They reiterated that. They said point blank, your water body has been in jeopardy since 2015. I have a copy of the letter. It recommended changes to happen. Those changes didn't happen. Because they didn't happen, we've had several algae blooms and alum treatments that are only going to increase if we don't take proactive measures now. I want to reiterate that there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of people that are fearful. Mr. Dubois, I got to highlight one more time one thing you said. Zoning, and I'll paraphrase. Zoning is not designed to protect neighbors from neighbors. It's to protect neighbors from polluting industrial, heavy commercial areas. It was never designed to keep one tenancy, one class of individuals, a renter, from a homeowner. There's nothing in our laws that justify a separation based upon socioeconomic strata. We need to think about those, and I encourage you to keep thinking about those during your deliberations and realize that there's nothing nefarious going on at the council. No matter what misinformation said, we are held to a higher standard, and we must tell the truth. We represent, in a republic, 25,000 residents. That is how our representative body and form of government work. We take that seriously. If we lie and do a bad job, we get fired in 2 years. So I'll leave you with that. Also, one more thing. You're all fairly new. The comp plan was worked on with members of the planning board, which aren't here yet. Matt Duvall was a sub. He was temporary. You were there sometimes. If you need Tim McLeod, Dana Staples, and myself, who are on the future land use chapter of the comp plan to come and speak to you, just ask. We're there. Okay, we're offering. Maybe we'll give you a little insight on our intent. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wishes to comment? Seeing none, we will move on to item number 6, planning board items for discussion. City council chambers are not available June 14th and November 8th. So we need to consider either a new location or modify our schedule. To be clear, staff doesn't just mean like this. In the past, that has meant the entire building. Is that the case this time?
I believe it is. It's for the voting.
Right, so just so people understand, it doesn't just mean this room, like the community, like this building is off limits on those dates.
So I think it's really establishing a new date for those months.
How do people feel about the third Tuesday as opposed to
I like it.
the second Tuesday?
I like it 'cause
I'll let people who have calendars with them check, but.
I like it because selfishly I had a conflict on the 14th.
I would say that keeping it on a Tuesday, to me, is more important than which week it occurs on, only because Tuesdays are the day of the week that the planning board has a meeting. And so if someone hears, oh, the planning board is having a meeting next week, they may not realize the meeting next week is on a Thursday, because our meetings are always on Tuesdays.
Maybe the 7th?
Whatever works.
Does the 7th give time for staff?
It would be better if it was the third Tuesday in June. We can really get that, make sure we get that FB environmental report. I think that works better for us.
So you would prefer the 21st?
Yeah.
So the 21st or the 28th would be best for staff with regard to June?
Correct.
How do folks feel about 21st is no? You're good?
I'm good, 21st.
21st?
I'd prefer the 28th.
You prefer the 28th?
21st, fine.
Okay, how, instead of going around, does anyone have a preference between the 21st or the 28th? So 28th
Yes, please.
is preferred. Does anyone have a conflict with the 28th?
I prefer the 21st.
Can you set up the Battle Royale ring outside chamber so that they can figure out which day we're gonna?
Well, there's also, I think we have a sensitivity to, I mean, that's a half a month away,
Yeah.
if you want to look at it in those terms. Don't we have a responsibility to keep it as close to the date as possible?
Yeah, suppose so.
So I would suggest either the 7th or the 21st, but the 7th, it doesn't allow enough time for staff. So unless there's a major,
Could we even, I know you were talking about Tuesdays, but what about even the next day on the 15th?
It's possible. My preference is just to always keep them on Tuesdays, but if the board wants to do them another day.
I could
it's-
do the 28th if that's what you want to. It's totally fine.
No preference, no preference, no preference.
It's fine.
Prefer 21st, but
It's fine.
28th, okay. You still prefer the 21st as with proximal?
I do, but not because of my schedule. I just think we,
No, I mean, it's a good point to be made.
is it Zooming an option? Or are you tied up?
It's fine. I mean, I just had a lot of days that fall on my work schedule, and I work for Lewis and Fire, so I work 24-hour shifts. So in theory, if we're not doing anything, I could Zoom in, but it's just a lot. Like right now, I'm on duty, so I have to have somebody come in, work the hours that I'm here for me, and now I owe that person that time, it's man for man.
Gotcha.
So now on my days off, now I have to pay back that person the time that I've already spent while I'm at work to.
Well, now I feel guilty.
Well, it's okay. I know I'm probably one of the
28th
only,
it is.
the only one here that works a 9-to-5 job, and being only an associate member, but it's still.
Well,
now that I'm coming here on my work time, now I have to use more of my off time to pay back the people that are working for me
So
now.
I'm gonna stop you for a second. You guys should never say only an associate member, because you never know when you are gonna be voting. So there's no such thing as only. Everyone on the board is equally important with regard to that. So if June 28th is the date that represents no conflict, even if there's a preference for the 21st, I would suggest we do the 28th, if that's the date that everyone can actually make it. Yes?
Yes,
Great.
I think.
November 8th. We would have the 1st, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. Not the 22nd, probably, it's Thanksgiving week.
Yeah,
I feel like that's bad.
say.
The 15th.
15th? How does everyone feel about November 15th? Look, if you tell me you've got a conflict, I want to know what kind of scheduling guru you are.
My car
All right.
payments due, that's it.
Mine too, actually.
Right. Does that work for
That's all I
everybody,
got.
November 15th? I know, it's a long ways away. Yeah. All right,
All good.
good?
Yeah, works for me.
Upcoming items for June. Is there anything that, maybe it is getting late, is there anything that you felt like was a must?
No, just note that before next week's planning board meeting, we do have a site visit on Penley Corner Road. We did hear from 4 folks. We have enough for a quorum
But it's at 4 PM?
at 4 PM.
All
Yep.
right.
Do we have an actual physical address for that, roughly?
I will send directions.
Okay.
No, it's a parcel ID number. There is no actual address because
All
there's
right.
no house.
I'll
yeah.
just find
I'll
you guys
send
with a
directions.
compass.
And I drove by there today, and there's really no place to land a car. That might be helpful too, where to park.
So, if
Okay.
anyone, if we could all
Carpooling?
bring a chainsaw and, can you imagine? Oh my God.
So I
All
shouldn't
right.
wear heels? Just
Yeah.
kidding, just kidding,
There's a lot of ticks.
just kidding.
Oh yeah, we did a site plan for Warren once, and I remember we walked out, and every single one of us had like a dozen ticks on us. It was
Yeah,
crazy.
just
Yeah.
be careful. Wear long pants.
Yeah. Alrighty. Next item, adjournment.
I second.
Is there a motion? A motion to
Motion.
adjourn? Second?
Second.
Second. All those in favor? Meeting is adjourned.